The house was unusually quiet when I stepped inside that night. The only sound breaking the silence was the faint ticking of the kitchen clock. I placed my keys on the counter and kicked off my shoes, releasing a tired sigh. It had been a long day, and all I could think about was collapsing into bed. The weight of exhaustion tugged at me as I began walking down the hallway, but something made me stop. There was a soft light glowing beneath the guest room door, a light that wasn't supposed to be there. My heart skipped a beat as I remembered Uncle Max had mentioned needing a place to stay for a few days. I hadn't expected him to arrive today, but clearly, he was here now. A mixture of surprise and curiosity pulled me toward the door. Uncle Max was the kind of man who never seemed to stay in one place for too long. When he visited, he usually opted for a hotel, giving me my space. But tonight he was here in my house. I hesitated for a moment, biting my lip as I contemplated whether I should disturb him. Maybe he was already asleep. It had been a while since we last saw each other, and although I trusted him implicitly, there was something about the thought of him sleeping under my roof that felt strangely intimate. I quietly approached the door, my fingers grazing the doorknob. After a brief moment of indecision, I turned it, slowly pushing the door open. The sight that greeted me made my breath hitch. Uncle Max was lying on top of the neatly made guest bed, his tall, muscular frame stretched out across the covers. He was still fully dressed, his arm casually resting over his eyes, as if shielding himself from the dim light of the bedside lamp. The soft rise and fall of his chest indicated he was deeply asleep, entirely unaware of my presence. I stood frozen in the doorway for a moment, watching him. His usual stern expression was gone, replaced by a rare softness that I seldom saw. There was something calming about seeing him so at peace. A small smile tugged at my lips. Despite his intimidating exterior, Uncle Max was always kind to me, protective even. But as my gaze drifted downward, something else caught my attention. His shirt had ridden up slightly, revealing a narrow strip of skin just above the waistband of his jeans. I swallowed hard, a wave of unfamiliar heat spreading through me. It was such a small, inconsequential detail, yet it held my focus. I shouldn't be standing there, staring at him like this. A part of me knew I should turn around, head back to my room, and leave him to rest. But I couldn't move. I couldn't pull myself away from the quiet allure of the moment. My breath quickened as I took a small step forward, drawn by an invisible force. There was something magnetic about the way he lay there, completely at ease, utterly unaware of how closely I was watching him. It wasn't just exhaustion clouding my judgment anymore. It was something deeper, something I didn't fully understand. With careful steps, I made my way to the side of the bed. My heart was pounding now, louder than it had any right to be. I wasn't sure what had come over me. Maybe it was the stillness of the room, the low light, or the scent of his cologne lingering in the air. Whatever it was, it made me feel reckless. Standing by the bed, I felt an odd mix of nerves and excitement bubbling inside me. Uncle Max was still fast asleep, completely oblivious to the fact that I was watching him. His face, usually stern and composed, seemed so relaxed, almost vulnerable. I'd never seen him like this before. There was a strange pull, like gravity, urging me closer to him. I shouldn't be here. I knew that. But something kept me rooted to the spot, my eyes tracing the lines of his face, the way his dark hair fell slightly across his forehead. There was an undeniable allure in the way his chest rose and fell steadily, a quiet rhythm that seemed to match the beating of my own heart. Without really thinking about it, I took another step closer to the bed. My breath hitched, nerves prickling through me as I hesitated. I wasn't sure what I was doing or why, but my fingers itched to reach out, to touch, just to see if the warmth I imagined from his skin was real. "Max?" I whispered, barely audible. The sound of his name left my lips before I could stop it, a soft breath that lingered in the air. He didn't stir. Emboldened by his continued stillness, I slowly reached out, my hand trembling as my fingers hovered just above his wrist. I hesitated, nerves tightening my chest, but then, almost involuntarily, I let my fingertips brush against his skin. It was a light touch, feather soft, but it sent a jolt through me, like static electricity dancing along my skin. I could feel the steady pulse beneath his wrist, the warmth of his body seeping through his skin into mine. My breath caught in my throat, and I quickly pulled my hand back, feeling a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration. I stood frozen, half expecting him to wake up, to open his eyes and catch me standing there, guilty and unsure of how to explain myself. But he didn't. His breathing remained slow even. I let out a shaky breath, relief flooding through me. But along with the relief came something else, something more dangerous, a temptation I couldn't quite name. My gaze wandered back to the small sliver of skin exposed at his waist. The temptation to touch him again, to let my fingers trace the lines of his body, was overwhelming. My mind raced with conflicting thoughts. This was wrong, I shouldn't be here. But the longer I stood there, the more I wanted to ignore those thoughts, to give in to the strange desire that had crept up on me. "Max," I whispered again, my voice barely a breath. I knew I should leave, should turn around and walk away before this went any further, but I couldn't. There was a quiet intimacy in this moment, something unspoken and powerful that held me in place. I took a deep breath, my heart hammering in my chest as I let my hand drift back toward him, this time brushing against his forearm. The warmth of his skin sent a thrill through me, and I found myself leaning in slightly, watching his face for any sign that he might wake. He shifted slightly, a soft murmur escaping his lips, but he didn't open his eyes. My heart raced as I took another step closer, emboldened by his unconsciousness. I was standing so close to him now that I could feel the heat radiating from his body. My fingers itched to explore more, to see if his skin was as soft and warm as it seemed. "Max," I whispered again, my voice trembling slightly as I knelt beside the bed. His face was so close now, I could see the faint stubble along his jaw, the way his lips parted slightly as he breathed. The urge to lean in, to press my lips to his skin, was overwhelming. But I hesitated, fear and uncertainty gnawing at the edges of my mind. What was I doing? What would he think if he woke up right now? The thought sent a wave of panic through me, but even that wasn't enough to make me pull away. Instead, I found myself leaning closer, my heart pounding in my chest as I let my fingertips trail up his arm, brushing lightly over the muscles beneath his skin. He shifted again, his body stirring slightly under my touch, and I froze, my breath catching in my throat. But once again, he didn't wake. His breathing remained slow, steady. My fingers lingered for a moment longer before I finally pulled back, my mind racing. This was wrong. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't stop. The pull was too strong, too enticing. Slowly, I stood up, my gaze still locked on his face as I leaned over him, hesitating for only a moment before letting my lips press softly against the back of his hand. His skin was warm, the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the air around him. It was intoxicating. My heart raced as I kissed his hand again, the touch light, tentative. He shifted slightly, a soft sound escaping his lips, but he still didn't wake. Emboldened by his continued slumber, I let my lips trail up his arm, leaving a soft, teasing kiss at the crook of his elbow. He murmured something unintelligible, his body stirring slightly beneath me. My heart pounded in my chest, fear and excitement warring within me. I should stop. I should leave before I did something I couldn't take back. But I didn't want to stop. With trembling hands, I let my lips drift higher, trailing soft kisses up his arm, inching closer to his shoulder. My gaze flicked to his face, watching for any sign that he might wake. His brow furrowed slightly, but his eyes remained closed, his breathing still steady. I hesitated just above the collar of his shirt, my heart racing as I stared at the bare skin of his neck. What would it feel like to kiss him there, to let my lips explore the hollow of his throat? Without thinking, I leaned down, pressing a soft kiss against his neck. The moment my lips brushed against his neck, a low sound escaped from his throat, somewhere between a groan and a sigh. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as panic surged through me. Had I gone too far? Was he about to wake up? My mind raced, but my body refused to move. Then, before I could react, his hand moved, sliding up to the back of my neck, his grip firm yet gentle. My eyes widened, heart pounding as I realized he wasn't asleep anymore. His fingers tightened slightly, holding me in place as his voice, thick with sleep, rumbled in the stillness of the room. "Leah," he whispered, his tone low and rough, sending a shiver down my spine. "What are you doing?" My throat tightened as I struggled to find my voice, my face burning with embarrassment. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. I should have left the room when I had the chance, should have stopped before it got this far. But now, with his hand holding me, his voice wrapping around me like a vice, I couldn't bring myself to move. My words faltered, tumbling out in a stammer. My mind screamed at me to pull away, to apologize and leave before this turned into something I couldn't take back. But I was frozen, trapped by the intensity of his gaze, the way his fingers rested possessively against my skin. His other hand slid up from the bed, cupping my waist and pulling me closer, his breath warm against my ear as he murmured softly, "Do you have any idea what you're doing to me?" I gasped, confusion and shock washing over me as his words sank in. His tone was thick with something dark, something I hadn't expected to hear. What did he mean by that? My mind scrambled to process what was happening, but the warmth of his hand on my waist, the gentle pressure of his grip, made it impossible to think clearly. I stammered again, my face burning. "I didn't mean—" But the words died on my lips as he pulled me closer, his mouth brushing against my ear in a way that made my pulse race. "I've wanted this for so long," he murmured, his voice sending shivers down my spine. "You don't even know." My heart stuttered, the weight of his confession hitting me like a tidal wave. Wanted this? The realization sent my thoughts spiraling, a mix of shock, fear, and something dangerously close to desire swirling together in my chest. I didn't know how to respond, couldn't wrap my mind around the implications of what he was saying. Before I could form a coherent thought, he moved, his hand on my waist sliding up to pull me onto the bed beside him. I gasped, my body pressed against his as his heat enveloped me. His gaze was intense, a deep, smoldering look that made my breath hitch. "You drive me crazy," he whispered, his voice low and rough, sending another wave of heat flooding through me. His lips hovered near mine, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath but not quite touching. "Uncle Max." I tried to speak, to say something that would break the tension between us, but he didn't give me the chance. His mouth was on mine in an instant, the kiss fierce and demanding, as if he had been holding back for too long and couldn't contain it anymore. I moaned softly, the sound surprising even myself as his hands gripped my waist tighter, pulling me closer to him. The kiss was overwhelming, stealing the breath from my lungs as I clung to him, my fingers digging into his shirt. Every nerve in my body was on fire, my mind clouded with the intensity of the moment. His lips moved from mine, trailing down my jaw to the curve of my neck, each kiss making my head spin. "You don't know what you do to me," he murmured against my skin, his hands sliding under my sweater, fingers brushing lightly against the bare skin of my waist. A soft gasp escaped me as I arched into his touch, the heat of his hands sending sparks of sensation racing through me. My mind was a blur of conflicting thoughts. This was wrong, it had to be, but my body refused to listen. It craved more, needed more. "Tell me you want this," he whispered, his breath hot against my ear as his fingers traced higher, skimming over my ribs. "Tell me you want me." I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was feel, the heat of his body against mine, the roughness of his voice as he spoke, the electric thrill of his touch. My mind screamed at me to stop, but my body had already made its decision. The words caught in my throat, my heart racing so fast it felt like it might burst from my chest. "I want you." A low growl escaped him, his grip tightening on my waist as he kissed me again, harder this time, more insistent. His hands roamed freely now, pushing my sweater up and over my head, leaving me exposed to his gaze. I shivered under his touch, my skin burning with the intensity of it all. His eyes darkened as they roamed over me, a look of raw hunger flickering in his gaze. "Beautiful," he murmured, his voice thick with desire. "So damn beautiful." I flushed, my pulse pounding in my ears as his hands explored my skin, tracing every curve, every line. His lips followed the path of his hands, kissing a trail down my neck, over my collarbone, teasing and tormenting me until I thought I might break under the weight of it all. "Uncle Max," I whispered, my voice trembling, but he silenced me with another kiss, his hands sliding lower as he whispered softly against my skin. "Just let me love you." Everything felt like it was happening at once, a whirlwind of sensations and emotions crashing over me. Uncle Max's words echoed in my mind, their meaning sinking in deeper with every second. I was breathless, overwhelmed by the intensity of his touch, the possessiveness in his eyes, the way he held me as though I belonged to him. A part of me still screamed that this was wrong, that it shouldn't be happening. But another part, a stronger part, was giving in completely, surrendering to the moment. He kissed me again, his lips fierce and demanding as they pressed against mine. Every kiss felt like a claim, a declaration of something that had been held back for too long. I could feel the tension in his body, the raw need in every movement. It was as if all of the barriers between us had crumbled, leaving nothing but the truth of what we both wanted. His hands slid up my sides, exploring with a purpose. The heat of his touch sent shivers racing through me, and I found myself arching into him, craving the closeness, the connection. His fingers grazed the delicate skin just beneath my ribs, making me gasp as the sensation shot through me like electricity. "Leah," he murmured against my lips, his voice a low, dangerous whisper. "I've wanted this for so long. Longer than you can imagine." There was something desperate in the way he said it, something that made my pulse quicken. My mind was still spinning, trying to make sense of the situation, but my body had already made its decision. Every touch, every kiss, pulled me deeper into the moment, leaving no room for hesitation or doubt. His lips left mine, trailing down my neck with a slow, deliberate precision that made my head spin. Each kiss was a new kind of torment, a mixture of pleasure and tension building in my chest until I thought I might explode. His hands roamed over my bare skin, and I shuddered at the heat of his touch, the way his fingers seemed to leave a trail of fire in their wake. I gasped as his mouth found the sensitive spot just below my ear, a soft whimper escaping me before I could stop it. His hands were everywhere now, exploring my body with a confidence that made my heart race. There was no hesitation in the way he touched me, no uncertainty. He knew exactly what he wanted, and he wasn't holding back. "Tell me you want this," he whispered again, his breath hot against my skin. His fingers slid lower, tracing the line of my waist, teasing me, making my breath hitch. "Tell me you want me." I could barely think, let alone speak. My mind was a blur, clouded by the intensity of everything happening around me. All I could feel was the heat of his body against mine, the way his hands moved with a purpose that left no doubt as to what he wanted. I swallowed hard, trying to find my voice, but the words seemed trapped in my throat. My voice came out as a breathless whisper, trembling with uncertainty and desire. "I want you." The moment the words left my lips, his grip tightened and he pulled me even closer. His eyes darkened, and I could see the hunger there, the raw need that had been simmering beneath the surface for too long. He kissed me again, harder this time, more demanding, as if he had been waiting for this moment for years. My body responded to him instinctively, arching into his touch, craving more of the heat and pressure of his hands on my skin. His fingers trailed lower, pushing aside the fabric between us until there was nothing left to separate us. I was exposed now, completely vulnerable beneath his gaze, but instead of fear, I felt a strange sense of exhilaration. He leaned back slightly, his eyes roaming over me with an intensity that made my heart pound in my chest. "You're beautiful," he murmured, his voice rough with desire. "So damn beautiful." I flushed under his gaze, my skin tingling with the weight of his words. No one had ever looked at me like that before, as if I was the only thing in the world that mattered. The way he touched me, the way he spoke, it was as if he had been waiting for this moment for longer than I could imagine. He kissed me again, softer this time, his lips lingering on mine as his hands continued their exploration. Every touch sent a new wave of heat rushing through me, making my head spin with the intensity of it all. I was lost, completely and utterly consumed by him. His lips moved lower, trailing down my neck, over my collarbone, teasing me with the promise of more. I gasped as his hands slid up my sides, his fingers skimming over every curve, every line of my body. There was no part of me that he left untouched, no inch of skin that escaped his attention. "Uncle Max," I whispered, my voice trembling as he continued to kiss his way down my body. But he silenced me with a soft, murmured, "Shh, just let me love you." His words sent a shiver through me, and I closed my eyes, surrendering completely to the moment. There was no turning back now, no stopping what had already begun. His lips, his hands, his body, it was all too much, too overwhelming, and yet I craved every second of it. His hands slid lower, his touch becoming more insistent, more demanding. I gasped, my body arching into him as he explored, pushing me to the edge of something I couldn't quite name. The tension between us was building, growing with every touch, every kiss, until it felt like I might shatter under the weight of it. "Leah," he whispered, his voice a low growl as he kissed the sensitive skin just above my waist. "You're mine now." The morning sunlight filtered softly through the curtains, casting a golden hue over the room. My heart was still racing as I lay there, pressed against Uncle Max's warm, sleeping form. The memories of the night before played over in my mind. Every kiss, every touch, every whispered word still fresh and vivid. But with the dawn came a new feeling, one I couldn't ignore. Guilt. As I looked at him, his arm draped possessively over my waist, the reality of what we had done began to settle in. He was my uncle. This wasn't just a fleeting moment of desire. It was something that could have serious, lasting consequences. I should feel happy, content even, but instead, my stomach twisted with a mixture of confusion and regret. What had we done? I shifted slightly beneath his arm, careful not to wake him. My fingers grazed the rough stubble along his jaw, a part of me still marveling at how peaceful he looked in his sleep. There was no sign of the intensity from the night before, no hint of the hunger that had driven both of us to cross that invisible line. Now, in the quiet morning light, it felt almost surreal, like a dream I was slowly waking from. But it wasn't a dream. It had been real, too real. I turned my gaze away from him, staring up at the ceiling as the weight of it all pressed down on me. What would happen now? How could we go back to the way things were before? The bond we shared had been irrevocably altered, and there was no undoing it. I felt a lump rise in my throat, a sickening realization that the choices we'd made in the heat of the moment would have repercussions far beyond this bedroom. What would people say if they knew? What would our family think? The very thought sent a wave of panic through me, tightening my chest. I swallowed hard, trying to push those thoughts away, but they lingered, dark and heavy, casting a shadow over the fleeting warmth of the morning. Uncle Max stirred beside me, his grip on my waist tightening slightly as he murmured something in his sleep. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I waited for him to wake. The last thing I wanted right now was to face him, to see that same desire in his eyes and have to confront what it meant. But instead of waking, he only shifted closer, his face nuzzling into the crook of my neck. His breathing remained steady, soft and rhythmic. For a moment I allowed myself to relax again, to sink back into the warmth of his embrace. But the guilt gnawed at me, relentless and unyielding. I needed to get up. I needed to leave the room, to clear my head and figure out what I was going to do next. Slowly, carefully, I began to slide out from under his arm, my movements gentle so as not to disturb him. My feet touched the cool floor, and I stood, wrapping the blanket around myself as if it could shield me from the storm of emotions swirling inside. The room felt too quiet, too still, as I stood there staring down at him. A part of me wanted to crawl back into bed, to lose myself in his warmth again, to pretend that everything was okay. But I knew better. Pretending wouldn't fix anything. I took a deep breath, my hands trembling as I let the blanket fall away and reached for my clothes. The fabric felt strange against my skin, a reminder of the intimacy I had shared with him only hours before. It felt like a lifetime ago now. Dressed, I quietly left the room, stepping into the hallway and closing the door behind me. The house was eerily silent, The ticking of the clock in the kitchen, the only sound breaking the stillness. My mind was racing, filled with questions I didn't have answers to. What would I say to him when he woke up? How could we possibly go back to the way things were before? The thought of facing him again made my heart pound, but I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. Sooner or later, we would have to talk about what happened, about where we stood now. But not yet. I needed time to think, to process everything. I made my way to the living room, collapsing onto the couch with a heavy sigh. My body ached with exhaustion, but my mind wouldn't let me rest. The reality of what we had done loomed over me, casting a dark shadow that I couldn't escape. As I stared blankly at the wall, my phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling me from my thoughts. I reached for it, my heart skipping a beat when I saw the message notification from Uncle Max. The words on the screen made my stomach flip. "We need to talk." I stared at the message, my hands shaking as I typed out a reply, the weight of his words pressing down on me. He was right, of course. We did need to talk. But I wasn't ready. Not yet. I hit send before I could second-guess myself. Give me some time. Time. That's what I needed, but I wasn't sure it would be enough to untangle the mess we had created. There was no going back now, no undoing what we had done. And as much as I wanted to believe that love could justify it, the reality was much more complicated. I lay back on the couch, closing my eyes as the morning sunlight streamed through the windows. No matter what happened next, nothing would ever be the same again. The weight of that truth settled over me like a heavy blanket, suffocating and inescapable. And deep down I knew this was only the beginning.